Samuel 17. 1 Samuel 17. We're going to skip around a little bit. I think all of us are more than familiar with the concept and the general storyline of David and Goliath. One of the problems with this story is that it has been adopted by general culture and by common culture as a way to express when someone who is kind of outmatched in the real underdog in a football game, that it's a real David and Goliath situation, and how David has somehow risen to the occasion and slew the Goliath. It's almost too well known so that it loses the impact that it had. This is a turning point in Israel's history that is going to be told and retold by everyone involved in Israel as a way of saying God chose the right man for the job. Right? He's already been anointed as king over Israel, but again, Saul is still sitting on the throne. It's going to be several more years before David is the actual king, or actually sitting on the throne as king. But this is one of those things that, if you're an Israelite in that era, or if you're an Israelite now, you look back and say, well, did God make the right choice? Well, look, he killed Goliath. So it's a lot more specific to their needs and to their experience than to just say, well, one football team beat another football team. We're just going to start by reading verses 4 through 11. And I want us to answer this question: who was Goliath and what was at stake? What was the big picture of what was going on around that valley at this time? Chapter 17, verse 4. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, which is one of the capital cities of the Philistines, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. His shield bearer went in front of him. And Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? Are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come out to me. If he's able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us. And the Philistine said, this day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other. On hearing the Philistine's words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. So who's at the head of the line being dismayed and terrified? King Saul. So there's not anybody in that camp that wants to go out and fight against him. And depending on what translation you're reading and depending on what ancient manuscripts you're using, you get slightly different size on some of these things. The largest is the general category of about 9 feet tall. And not just tall, he was big, he was broad. His armaments that he was carrying were extremely heavy. The one that really gets my attention is that he had a weaver's beam, which basically not that great big stick that was sticking out of the stone, but this long staff, and attached to it was a spearhead that weighed roughly a bowling ball. Okay? It was somewhere around 15, 16 pounds worth of metal on the end of this stick that he was going to throw at you. It wouldn't have to pierce you. If it just hit you, it would break everything you had. So, he was carrying huge armaments. His armor on top was a huge piece of leather, and then in those days they were able to work with both bronze and iron. And this would have been bronze sheets that were attached to the leather. So if you could get past the bronze, you probably couldn't get past the leather. So it would be hard to land any kind of blow on the front. He was wearing a helmet. the front armor went down probably close to his knees, and then he had some armor that went from the knees or from the thighs on down to his feet. Same kind of stuff, leather covered over with little brass scales. This guy is almost an impenetrable fortress coming at you, and he's huge. I went and did a little bit of research to see how realistic 9 feet might be, how big you have to be 9 feet. And in the last couple of hundred years, since we've had scientific verification and people being measured and recorded for these kind of things, there have been quite a number of people that were between 8 and 9 feet tall. Right now, worldwide, there's about 2,800 that are over 7 feet tall. So being excessively tall is not unheard of. There was a fella that died, I think he died in the early part of the 1900s, and he holds the record for those that they actually measured, and he was 8 feet 11. Right? So when you're talking in cubits and spans, you're talking about from the distance from your elbow to your end of your finger, that's a cubit, and a span was about half of that. So depending on whose cubit you're using, who's doing the measuring, this comes out somewhere between 8 and 9 feet tall. And again, in the last couple of hundred years, they have measured and verified several men and at least one woman. There was a woman who lived in China. Unfortunately, she died very young because being that big causes all kinds of other problems medically. Goliath doesn't seem to have had a lot of medical infirmities. We don't know how old he was, but he was big, he was healthy, and he was ready to fight. And what he was asking for seems to have been something they actually did. I've seen it in movies, but I've never really thought about it being a real thing. But evidently, what Goliath wanted was, you send out your champion, and I'll be the champion for our side, and we'll just have a one-on-one, and whoever wins, wins. And we're not going to have a battle where we all come together and fight. We're just going to send out our champions, and then whoever wins will be in charge. So it's a no-win situation as far as the Israelites are concerned. They don't have anybody that size. Did a little bit of looking into why he might have been that big. There are two main think-sos. One is that he's a leftover Nephilim. The Nephilim were those mighty men of renown that were born when the sons of God took the daughters of men and married them. That's a possibility that somehow there was Nephilim blood that came on down through Noah and his sons. Another possibility, and it's probably kind of interrelated, is that he was a descendant of the Anakim. The Anakim is that bunch that when the 12 spies went into Israel to spy it out, and they came back out, what did they say about the people they saw? We're like grasshoppers in our own eyes. So these people are huge. Evidently, Goliath was in that category, that had the spies seen him or any of his family members, they would have come away with that impression that he's just terrifying. He's too big. Nobody's going to be able to fight. So maybe his ancestors were one of the reasons that the Israelites ended up dying in the desert, because they didn't believe God could help them win that battle. Same situation is happening in the valley. You've got a bunch of Israelites looking across the valley at a guy they think they can't defeat. They don't trust God. They're not asking for help. They're just saying, we can't do anything about this. And so they're all staying exactly where they are. Okay, go to chapter 17, verse 12. We get reintroduced to David in this passage. Now David was the son of an Ephrathite named Jesse, who was from Bethlehem in Judah. Jesse had 8 sons, and in Saul's time he was very old. Jesse's 3 oldest sons had followed Saul to the war. The firstborn was Eliab, the second Abinadab, and the third was Shammah. David was the youngest. The 3 oldest followed Saul, but David went back and forth from Saul to tend his father's sheep. At Bethlehem, we find out a little bit later on, one of the reasons he went back and forth was to service his brothers. He would take them food at the front lines. So we meet him first as one who's called in to play music for Saul. We'll find out at the end of the chapter that Saul's still a little bit fuzzy on who he is or who he belongs to, at least. He'll ask where this kid came from. But you notice the three, right? Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah. What do we know about those three guys? Samuel looked at them and said, that must be them, right? Those are the guys. And God said, nope. All the way down till they ran out of sons, and he said, do you have another one? He said, yeah, I've got David. He's the youngest, but he's out watching the sheep. Well, we're not eating dinner till you bring him in. So they go and get David and bring him in. So we've met these three guys before. They're the bigger, they're the badder, they're the full-time soldiers living in tents on the front line. What are they not doing? The same thing everybody else is not doing, right? They're not fighting with Goliath. They're not doing anything. So when David shows up, he comes for the purpose of just helping his brothers. That's all he's there to do in the first place. Skip down to verse 34. Verse 34. David said to Saul, your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of the Philistine. So his three older brothers are professionals. They've been living in tents on the front line. They're doing nothing. David shows up and says, I'll take care of it. I've got experience. What's his experience? Fighting animals to keep them away from his daddy's sheep. So how many people were there to see David fight against the bear and to fight against the lion? Probably nobody, right? He's out there by himself. His brother accuses him of being conceited, a show-off, that he wants to just get up here and watch the battle, that he's not really there for any good reason. He's a kid. And so they dismiss him. Unfortunately for them, fortunately for the armies of Israel, Saul listens to the kid. He actually lets him tell him about his experience, tell him who he is and what he's going to accomplish fighting against this giant. If they're still playing by the rules that Goliath has laid down, he's saying Israel is putting all of our hope and all of our trust and all of our future in the hands of this kid who tells me he killed a lion and a bear. So he buys in. But that tells you something about Saul again. He doesn't know much about David. He just knows that David is willing to do something. Think back to when Jonathan led the battle and Saul was going to kill him because he ate the honey while he was out in the field. Saul is willing for other people to get out and do, but again, still not a great leader. Go down to verse 54. Verse 54. David took the Philistine's head and brought it to Jerusalem, and he put the Philistine's weapons in his own tent. As Saul was watching David going out to meet the Philistine, he said to Abner, commander of the army, Abner, whose son is this young man? Abner replied, as surely as you live, your majesty, I don't know. The king said, well, find out whose son this young man is. As soon as David returned from killing the Philistine, Abner took him and brought him before Saul, with David still holding the Philistine's head. Whose son are you, young man? Saul asked him. David said, I am the son of your servant, Jesse of Bethlehem. Okay, so we find out who David is. We find out what David's credentials are. And Saul is just finding out bits and pieces along the way. He doesn't know much about him. I went back and looked, and it's interesting that these are chapter after chapter, right? Because Saul met David, and David came to play music for him in chapter 16. We don't know how many times David has been to be with Saul. it seems like maybe it's projected over a long period of time so that maybe they've met, but they haven't spent a lot of time together. So then David kind of reappears in this one, and so some scholars have trouble getting the timeline figured out. Exactly how long after David played music for him does he show up as a warrior, all those kinds of things. But why does Saul want to know whose kid he is in the end? It's the important part. His daddy is now exempt from paying taxes, right? Their whole family is exempt. When David got to camp, he starts asking around, what would happen if somebody went in there and killed that giant? And the answer is, well, he would be the champion of all of Israel. Saul would exempt his family from taxes from now on. And Saul would give him his daughter to marry. Right? That's going to actually happen later on. And again, to Saul's dismay, the daughter's going to like David better. Most people end up liking David better. But he's going to do all of those things for David. But the first question he has to answer is, whose kid is he? Right? So at some point, we just have to kind of put this in a big pot. At some point during this time frame, Saul meets David, finds out where he's from, realizes that he has some talents, and then is able to move on. Before we talk about the actual killing of the giant, go over to chapter 16. We'll go back to last week for just a second. Chapter 16, verse 18. Well, we'll start in 17. Saul said to his attendants, "Find someone who plays well and bring him to me." One of the servants answered, "I have seen a son of Jesse of Bethlehem who knows how to play the lyre. He is a brave man and a warrior. He speaks well and is a fine-looking man, and the Lord is with him." So they bring David to play music for Saul. But did you see the definition, who David is? Not just a son of Jesse, not just a musician, but he is a warrior, and he speaks well. So he has the right thing to say at the right time, and we'll see that in just a second. So when he goes into battle against Goliath, go back to chapter 17, and we'll go to verse 45. 17:45. David said to the Philistine, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin. But I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I'll strike you down and cut off your head. This very day I will give the carcasses of the Philistine army to the birds and the wild animals, and the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle belongs to the Lord, and he will give all of you into our hands." So he is someone who can play music, he's a good warrior, and he's a good speaker, right? That's one of the best speeches in the Old Testament, and he's wasting it on a Philistine. I mean, he's just telling this guy, look, you've got no hope. I am representing the God of Israel. I'm representing the one who is going to give you into my hands and then give the army into our hands. There's nothing you can do about it. The battle is already won because the battle belongs to the Lord. So all those who are gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves. The battle belongs to the Lord, and he will give you into our hands. So again, when we talk about a David and Goliath situation, if Alabama and Clemson are playing, and they start talking about how Clemson is the underdog and it's going to be a David-Goliath matchup or one of those things, that gives no glory to God. That's just a euphemism. It's just a historical statement they use to try to make conversation about a football game. David's got it straight. He says, I'm coming at you representing the one that you've been bad-mouthing all this time. And I'm going to take care of you because God is with me. So what does he do? We all know the story. He picks up 5 stones and he takes his sling and he runs at the enemy. He doesn't kind of, amble down into the battle zone. He picks up his feet and runs. And on his way, he loads up one stone, and he throws the one stone, and it hits Goliath in the forehead. Either Goliath is not dead or unconscious. He falls, and when he falls, David takes Goliath's own sword and cuts his head off with it. And in typical ancient Israeli fashion, starts walking around with it. I'm a city boy, and all of our food came from the grocery store, so I was never even around when we butchered anything. But to cut somebody's head off and wander around with the head in your hand until you actually get an audience with the king and go, look what I got, that's really odd. It's a strange thing to me. But David is the great victor of the day, and the Philistines aren't just beaten, they're chased all the way home. As you get down into some of the descriptions of where they went, they chased them all the way to the crossroads. And some of these guys split off to go to Ekron, and some of them split off to go to Gath. But they're going home, and most of them don't make it home. So there's a lot of widows in Gath and Ekron that night because David stands up and does what he's supposed to do. A couple of more kind of interesting things that pop up here. When he kills Goliath and he cuts off his head, there are two things that he now has in his possession. He has Goliath's head, and he has Goliath's sword in particular. It says he has his armaments, but we don't really run into the armaments much anymore. But we do run into the sword. The head he delivers to Saul, or shows to Saul. And the armaments, it says, he put in his tent. Now, both of those are kind of odd because it says he took the head to Jerusalem. At the time that he killed Goliath, the Israelites did not own Jerusalem. The Jebusites were still living up there on top of the hill. And so I was trying to figure out, well, how could it be said that he took Goliath's head to Jerusalem? Well, the answer is that it's projecting to a time in the future where that belonging of David's probably went with him when he inhabited Jerusalem. He's the first king to be king in Jerusalem. His armies beat the Jebusites, run them out of Jerusalem. He sets up his kingdom there on top of the hill. If you go to Jerusalem today, there's an inner city wall, the city of David they call it. And the city of David is that Jebusite stronghold where they finally went up through the crevice and conquered the Jebusites, and David sets up his kingdom. When he enters in, what are some of the things that he would take with him when he opens up his palace and begins ruling from Jerusalem? Well, some of the things that he had won in battles, some of the spoils of war, and one of those may well have been the skull of the giant Goliath. Again, it's just kind of an oddity in the text. The other one is, did David take the weapons and put them in his tent? Or many scholars think what it's saying is he put them in God's tent. As God's representative, he put them in the tabernacle. The reason that they guess that is because later on, when David is running away from Saul, he needs a weapon. The weapon that he gets is Goliath's sword, and Abiathar the priest has it at the tabernacle. So if it started out in David's personal tent, he was just visiting. He didn't have a tent on the front line like his brothers. If he put it in some tent belonging to him, then later it gets put in the tabernacle. So it's one of those spoils of war that ends up being God's possession. It's in the tabernacle. That's one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament, by the way. We'll talk about it later. But David and his men are running for their lives, and they don't have anything to eat. And they show up at the tabernacle, and in the tabernacle, there's the showbread. And the showbread was 12 loaves of bread that were rebaked every week. And at the end of the week, they would take the showbread off the table and put the new loaves on the table. And then the priests were allowed, but only the priests, were allowed to eat last week's showbread. David and his men show up at the tabernacle, and they don't have anything to eat. Abiathar gives them the showbread. It shows back up in the New Testament when it's talking about Jesus being the high priest. So he's our great high priest. He doesn't have the credentials to be from the offspring of Aaron, but Abiathar gave the showbread to David. Jesus is a descendant of David. So all kinds of wonderful things there. Then he asked Abiathar, do you have any weapons here? We need some help. Abiathar says, well, I've got that sword you took off that giant. And so he gives him back the sword that he took off of Goliath. And he ends up in possession. So, well, the thing that's not hard to understand is that this kid that, Samuel looked at first, and, he's just a kid. Eliab and Shammah and, what's the other one's name? They don't even remember his name. Abinadab, there you go. And Abinadab, those guys are nobodies, right? They were sons of the same father, maybe even sons of the same mother, but they're nobodies. David is the king, and it's through David's lineage that Messiah comes. So those other guys, maybe the people around them loved them, but David is David. And here's just another indication that when God chose David to be king over Israel, it was the right choice. Yeah. And again, and none of this, well, it shows you in a little bit, but it doesn't show you even the greatest quality. Because the greatest quality isn't that he can, hit something with a slingshot or cut off a giant's head. The greatest indication of who David is that he went out there to fight him in the first place. He was like, look, dude, I belong to God, and you're messing with God, and you're done. There's nothing you can do about it. I fight for the God of Israel, and you've been making fun of him and his army, and it's over. And God gives him the strength to finish him off. One of the greatest stories in all the Old Testament. Like I say, lots of people know the story, but it's more important than the way it gets applied sometimes.
Have you ever tried to throw a slingshot?
I am not capable of using one of those ancient, no.
When I was a kid, I tried that. It don't work.
It don't work. We'll tell you guys about it.